So my name's Tony Langdon, and we're going to look tonight at how to understand how project finance is usually managed. Different companies will sometimes do things differently, but we're going to look at generally how project finance is managed. So I'll deliver the presentation and there'll be plenty of opportunities to ask questions. So just interrupt me if a question occurs to you. And the payoff is that you'll have an understanding of the roles and tasks involved in managing project finances. So we need to think about why project finances need to be managed. And the fact that they do need to be managed may seem fairly obvious, but we need to understand why they need to be managed to make sure that we can address all the reasons when we're managing project finance. So the first reason is we need to ensure project costs are controlled. The project can't be allowed to spend more money than the organisation has, or more money than the organisation wants to spend on that project. So it shouldn't spend more than the project is worth to the organisation unless there's some overriding reason why this is necessary. So say, for example, if the project is to deliver compliance with a regulation, then the business case for the project that says why it's needed should make it clear that unless we comply with that regulation, we don't have a business and we can value that business. So if we comply with the regulation, our business is worth, let's say, £10 million a year. But if we can't comply with it, then perhaps we can't sell anything. So the business isn't worth anything. So we can see that even if a project isn't going to generate any more money, it might have a value to the business. And we need to control project costs to make sure we don't spend more than the project is worth. And we need to ensure that a project doesn't adversely affect an organisation's cash flow, because organisations need to manage their cash flow to make sure that there's always enough money in the bank to pay the bills that are becoming due. And thus, projects need to provide a view as to what costs they will be incurring and when these costs will be incurred, so that the finance department can ensure that the costs can be paid when they need to be. So this is why we manage finance. It's for these reasons that we've got on the screen. Okay. So the project's budget or forecast is the amount of money that the project is allowed to, the amount of money that the project is allowed to spend is called its approved funding. So when a project is given the go-ahead to start, it will be given an amount of money to spend that is called its approved funding. And it shouldn't spend more than its approved funding. But it's not uncommon for organisations to have a level of tolerance that's applied to the approved funding figures. We've talked about tolerance briefly when we talked about the project charter. What the tolerance means is that it may be permissible for the project to spend slightly more than its approved funding, so long as the tolerance is not exceeded. So the tolerance may say you can spend up to 5% more or 10% more than your approved funding, but it would be rare to be more than 5%. So the approved funding is set often at the outset of the project, and the project shouldn't spend more than that, or at least it should remain within the level of tolerance that's been set. Now, it is the case that funding for projects may be approved in stages. So at the start of the project, what's approved for the project may only be enough for the first stage, the initiation stage. And during the initiation stage, the project would be expected to produce a forecast of what it needs to spend in the next stage or stages in order to then receive approved funding for those stages. So towards the end of the initiation stage, the project will have to produce a forecast of what it needs to spend. And given that the amount of planning and design work that can be done during the initiation stage is relatively small, the project is going to be, the forecast of what money needs to be spent is still going to be somewhat inaccurate. Now, sponsors always want an accurate cost for the project, but before all the planning has been done, it's very difficult to give sponsors and anybody else a very accurate estimate of what the project is going to cost. You really need to do the planning to then know what the project is going to cost. And it is expected that projects can forecast the cost of the next stage reasonably well, because we plan for the next stage during the stage we're in. But it is expected that subsequent stages, the financial forecast is going to be less accurate. The forecast is developed by looking at all the costs that might occur in the next stage. And it'll be prepared by the project manager, and it will usually need to be approved by the project steering group and the sponsor before the project makes a formal request to get that new funding approved. So the process will be the project manager creates the new forecast, he shares it with the steering group and sponsor. If they're happy, then the request is made for formal approval for the funding. Once that formal approval funding is granted, the project manager should record the amount of funding that has been approved, and they should also commit it to memory, because this amount of money that you're allowed to spend, it really is one of the most important numbers that the project manager should know and be carrying around in their head at all times, because somebody's going to ask you, how much are we allowed to spend on this? And you need to be able to say, this is the budget or the forecast that we have for this project. Now, sometimes it can be the case that what is approved is actually less than has been asked for. So you might ask for £100,000 for your project, but you might only get approved funding of 80,000. And effectively, this is the organisation confirming what the project is worth to it. The business case is merely a proposal as to what the project is worth. It's only when you actually ask for funding and you see what funding is approved that you really begin to know and understand what the project is worth to the organisation. Because if it's not worth very much, then you won't get very much approved funding to deliver it. Now, if the funding that is approved for the project is less than the request that's been made, the project manager and the project team will have to decide how they're going to change their plans so that the project can be delivered for the funding that has been approved. But we have to think about the fact that there may actually be no way that the project can be delivered for the amount of funding that has actually been approved if it's not been approved in full. So if the team think that there's no way that the project can be completed for the approved funding, the project manager needs to take this back to the steering group and the sponsor for a decision as to whether the project should be cancelled or not. Because if it can't be delivered, then maybe the project should be cancelled. The other option is often to deliver less. So sometimes the plans may be changed so that instead of delivering so much, we deliver a bit less than that, and we can do that for the amount of money that has been approved. But it's really important that that decision to deliver less is taken by the steering group and by the sponsor and not by the project manager. If we agree to move forwards with the forecast cost that's been approved, that then becomes the project's budget, and the project can begin to spend money in accordance with that budget. So we're making a slight distinction between these two words, budget and forecast here, but not all organisations will make this distinction. But what we're basically saying is that a forecast is a projection of what the project needs to spend. And it's a forecast if that projection is made before the funding is approved. Once the funding is approved, it then becomes a budget that the project can then spend. So it may help you just to understand that project finance is an iterative process where it's done in stages. We develop a plan, we develop the forecast for that plan, we ask for the funding for the plan. If we're given that funding, that then becomes our budget that we can spend on running the plan. And as we're running the plan, when we get towards the end of one stage, if we still need to request additional funding, we will do that in the stage to make sure that we have the funding to move forwards. So any questions on the project forecast or budget?
Not from me.
No question from me, sir.
Okay, yeah, I've just seen the chat facility from Yetunde. So Yetunde. Okay, so that was the project budget or forecast. So the next thing we need to think about is what are the sources of cost to a project? Because it's usually likely the case that a project will have to pay for some or all of the cost of the internal staff who work on the project. Certainly if we're going to hire the services of external organisations, suppliers and the like, they will charge for their services. So we'll certainly have to pay our suppliers for the services they provide, but it's often the case that we have to pay a cost of internal staff who are working on the project. So even though the organisation is paying their wages, the project is expected to account for the time that those people spend working on the project. And it's also the case that we have to spend money on the external staff who are working on the project, who may be hired temporarily to come and join the project team. Sometimes these people might be called contractors or freelancers. But they're resources that can be hired by the organisation as temporary staff to come and join the organisation and work within the organisation. So when we're thinking about the cost of internal staff, it's sometimes the case that some staff may be provided to the project free. Often subject matter experts fall into that category. But if you are being provided with internal staff to work on your project, I would say it's important for the project manager to fully understand the basis on which staff are being provided to them to work on the project so that the cost can be forecast. Because if you think you're getting somebody for no cost and actually you are supposed to be paying for them, your forecast won't reflect that. It will have a zero cost for that person, whereas it should have an internal cost. So in terms of what a project might pay for the internal staff, it's sometimes done by paying the department that the member of staff normally works in what is called a day rate. So a day rate is the amount of money that represents the cost of that member of staff to their department for one working day. And that amount can often be many hundreds of pounds. It's not unusual for day rates to be 400 or 500 or even much more per day. And that's the cost of that person when they're working in their department. And so the project may have to charge that, or may have to pay that day rate to the department in order to get that member of staff to work on their project. Now, I've mentioned that the day rate may be £400 or £500 or £600 a day. The cost of external temporary staff will be at least that, and if you're paying a supplier to provide staff to you, you can expect it to be a lot more than those rates. So often using internal staff is often the cheapest way of getting resource for your project. And organisations may have a standard day rate for particular types of workers. So for example, there may be a standard day rate for project managers or for business analysts or software developers. And so the project can forecast the cost of those internal staff by forecasting how many days work is going to be needed from each type of worker. And often that's done on a monthly basis, because you can say, right, well, in the month of May, we're going to need 2 software developers. In the month of May, there are 21 working days. So 2 developers for 21 days each gives us 42 days. So you can say, well, we need to budget for the cost of 42 man days time from a software developer. And this is how the project budget starts to be built up, by the project manager identifying the sorts of staff he needs, the sorts of skills, how much time he needs from them, and when that time is needed, whether it's needed this month, the next month, the following month, and so on. It's often very easy to arrange your forecast in months, because the finance department will tend to work in months as well. So the reason you might need to hire temporary external staff is that the organisation may not have enough people that it can free up in the organisation to come and work on your project, or it may not have the skills that are needed. So hiring temporary staff can be one way around either that skills shortage or the resource shortage. And it's not unusual for organisations to perhaps provide a member of their internal staff to the project, but to want to hire somebody from outside the organisation on a temporary basis to do the work of the staff member who's coming to work on your project. And that's a process that's called backfilling. And the project may be asked to either directly pay the cost of that external temporary worker, or they may be asked to pay the day rate for the staff member who's coming to work on the project, and then the department will use that to pay for their temporary worker. Again, the project manager needs to be very clear as to what the arrangement is. There should be no uncertainty in the financial arrangements, because that can lead to problems. If the project needs the services of an external organisation, for example, if it needs legal advice or consultancy, then the cost of these services need to be included. And it's important that we understand whether VAT is payable on those costs and how the organisation deals with VAT. Another source of costs is equipment, so goods and materials that the organisation may be needed. And again, when we're forecasting the cost of the goods and equipment we need in order to deliver the project, we need to think about when are we going to need those things, and do we have to pay VAT on them so that we can forecast these costs properly. And then the final source of costs I wanted to mention is that certain large organisations may have some central costs that are incurred in running a department that is solely concerned with projects. So if the organisation has a projects department, then that department will have a management structure and administrative staff, and the organisation may want every project to pay a proportion of these central costs in order that the costs are charged to the business areas that benefits from the projects that are run by that department. So if the department costs £50,000 a year, and the organisation runs 50 projects a year, then each project would be expected to pay £1,000 towards these central costs, so that the managers and administrators that work in that department can have their salaries paid. So they're the source of costs that typically come into most projects. But it's important for the finance department to understand when these costs are going to be incurred. And this is why when we're creating our forecast, we do so on a monthly basis, so that the finance department can see money that they need to spend on goods, equipment and services and temporary staff in May, and what's needed in June and what's needed in July and so on. So we need to map when these costs are going to be incurred. Now, the finance department also needs to know under which headings the costs are being incurred, whether they are internal staff costs or external costs, whether they're goods and materials or whether they're services, because that affects how the finance department deals with those costs. And so if we have planned to, for example, hire 2 external staff members on a temporary basis, and we find that we can't get them, so we then go out to one of our suppliers and we engage the supplier to do the work that those internal staff were doing, we need to let the finance department know that a cost has moved from temporary external staff to services, because how they're going to deal with those costs and how they're going to plan for those costs changes. So if anything changes with where costs are being incurred, we need to let the finance department know. Now, the finance department may agree an amount of tolerance. So they may say, we don't need to know about any changes that are less than £5,000 or less than £10,000. You don't have to tell us about that. And that means that we don't have to keep going back to the finance department every time anything changes. It's only if something changes significantly do we have to go back to them and update them to say what the change has happened. So the next slide is really a piece of advice, and it's saying that we should try to capture the costs as they are incurred. So we should be trying to capture the actual costs as they're incurred, so that we have an accurate view of what money has been spent by the project. And often the finance department will make available the details of the invoices that have been paid on behalf of the project on a monthly basis. So at the start of May, you'll often be able to see all the invoices that the finance department have paid that came in April for your project. So you'll be able to see what costs have been paid. And many organisations will also have a time recording system where staff can record the amount of time that they spend working on their projects that they're assigned to. And that's particularly necessary where people may be assigned to work on more than one project at once. And often there'll be a timetable that determines the date by which all members of staff must have updated their time recording system with the details of the work that they've done, ready for those costs to be included in the project's budget. So what would normally happen is during the month of April, as staff are working on their project work, they will book their time to a project. At the end of the month, a process will run that adds up all the amount of time that has been spent working on a particular project and converts that to a cost using the day rate. And then that cost is charged to the project in the same way that the invoices that have been paid are charged to the project. So again, the project manager needs to make sure on a monthly basis they are capturing those staff costs into their project budget. So if the organisation doesn't have a time recording system, then the project manager should require everybody who is working on his project to report the time that they've spent working on the project, so that the project manager can capture that time and convert it to a cost. Now, any central costs that are incurred will usually be provided by the department making the central charges. They will tell you what amount of charge you have to incur each month, and they will charge the project that each month. So the project is spending that amount each month. And we've mentioned as well here that the steering group is going to need a regular update on the actual cost of the project. And this is one of the reasons why we should be capturing the costs as they are incurred, because if we're to give a regular update, we need to have an up-to-date view as to what the actual cost of the project is. And the report to the steering group will usually include the approved funding amount, so how much the project has been told it can spend, the actual costs incurred since the project steering group was last updated, and also the total amount that's been spent. There'll also be a forecast cost for the project, so that is the amount of money that's been spent to date, the actual amount, plus the remaining forecast to complete the project. Yeah? I think we have an example of a steering group report on the next page. And if the forecast cost of the project is greater than the approved funding, taking into account any tolerances that are allowed, that means that a decision will be needed from the steering group as to what to do while additional funding is sought. It's often the case that the sponsor will want the project to carry on working on the project whilst it doesn't have enough approved funding to finish. But that's quite a risky thing to do. And so it should be the case that a decision to continue working on a project whilst we seek additional funding, that decision needs to be taken at the steering group and documented so that the project manager is clear that it was a steering group decision to carry on whilst the forecast says we don't have enough money. So let's take a quick look at the example of a steering group report. So what we have here is a slide that you would typically show to a steering group, and it has the amount of approved funding for the project. So that says this project is allowed to spend in total £1.2 million. The next line is the actual costs that have been incurred since the last statement to the steering group. That basically says, this is what we spent since the last time we saw you. And here it's £63,434. And that means that our total actual costs to date are £701,871. So the project has been spending money prior to the previous statement. So we incurred actual costs prior to the previous statement. We've now spent a further 63,434. So we've added that to the money that was spent in the previous periods to give us our total actual spending to date. And the remaining cost, this is from our forecast. So from our forecast, we can say we're expecting to spend £499,129. And when you add the actual costs that we've spent, plus the remaining costs that we expect to spend, our forecast to complete the project is 1.201 million. And that is within a 5% tolerance that's allowed by project costs by the particular finance department. So we don't need to ask for further funding, because we're saying that based on what we spent to date, plus what we expect to still have to spend to finish the project, we're not going to spend over the tolerance amount above our approved funding. So we're not going to spend more than we're allowed to spend. So are there any questions on that example report to a steering group? Okay. There's some important concepts in there. The approved funding, what the project's allowed to spend, the actual costs that have been captured by all of the costs coming into the project manager's view via the finance department and via the other processes that exist. And so I just wanted to check, are there any questions on what we've got on the screen there?
Not from me.
No? Okay. So clearly what the project manager has to do in order to have these numbers available to him is to have a record as to what his approved funding is, to have a way of capturing all the actual costs as the project incurs for them and pays for them. And he also has to have a way of forecasting the project, what remains to be spent. And this is usually done on an Excel spreadsheet, often on two separate worksheets within the one spreadsheet. So he'll have a spreadsheet for the actuals that have been incurred and a spreadsheet for the forecast. He may also have another sheet that is the different funding approvals, but it would be a good practice to try and keep all of this information in one place, so that when it comes time to provide a report to the steering group on project funding, the project manager's got all the data they need to produce a report such as this, which, as you can see, is nice and simple. It lays out how much the project's allowed to spend, how much it has spent, what remains to be spent in order to complete the project, and hence what the forecast is to complete the project. If the forecast was more than 5% above the approved funding, the project manager would have to ask the steering group for a decision on whether to go and ask for more approved funding, or whether to stop work or what, because the project manager can take decisions up to the tolerance that's allowed, but they can't go beyond the tolerance. So they have to get permission to do that. So the next slide is about roles and responsibilities. And really the first thing to say is that anybody who is working on the project can identify a cost, and they should inform the project manager as soon as they become aware of any new cost or the potential for a new cost. And the project team should also make sure that the project manager is aware of any changes in costs. So for example, if a task is proving harder than expected and going to take longer than expected, that means that the time that the project manager has allowed for that task to take is going to change, and therefore the cost of that is going to change. But it's the project manager that's responsible for making sure that all the costs that the project may incur are identified, for creating the forecast, for capturing the actual costs, and updating the projected or forecast cost of the project using these actual costs. And it's the role of the project sponsor to actually secure the approved funding. It's not the project manager's job to get the funding that the project needs. That responsibility falls to the project sponsor. They have to find the money within the organization to make that project happen. So in summary, we can see that project finance needs to be managed on a regular basis if the project is going to remain in control. We've said that the forecast cost for a project is derived from the project's plans. So the plans we create are the basis for the forecast cost of the project. And changes to the forecast cost need to be captured and need to be advised to the steering group, because if the cost of the project is likely to change, the project group needs to be kept aware. Whilst the forecast cost remains lower than our approved funding, we can carry on. We don't need to stop work. The steering group doesn't need to do anything other than be aware that the forecast cost is less than the approved budget. But if the forecast cost goes above the approved budget, then we need to make the steering group aware. We need to seek additional approved budget, but we can take any tolerance that's allowed into account. So if the tolerance is 5%, we can spend 5% more than the approved budget before we're in trouble. And finally, it's the sponsor's job to ensure that the funding that's needed to deliver the project is available to the project at the right time. So that's the session on project finance. So are there any questions?
Please.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
We are talking about project finance. Now, as a project manager, who do you need to employ, like a accountant or?
Sure. Okay. So on a very small project, you wouldn't. The project manager would be able to do this work
Basically
themselves.
Accounting.
Yeah, it's very basic accounting. It's basically capturing the costs and forecasting the costs based on your plans. So on small projects, the project manager would do this. On a bigger project, you might well have somebody whose job it is within the project to manage project finances. That's often the case on very large projects, where the project has a significant budget to spend. They may employ somebody, or it may be somebody's sole job to manage finance. That's because there'll be a lot of actual costs coming in, and there'll be a lot of forecast costs changing. So they may need somebody, but this is very, very basic accounting here. It's often the case as well that in the finance department, there will be somebody who is particularly focused on project costs. They'll have some sort of project cost expert in the finance department who will tell all the project managers in the organization how to do their finances and act as a point of contact. So for any sort of true accounting questions, you can often go to this contact in the finance department to get those sorts of questions answered. And on the very largest of projects, where possibly the project requires a new company to be created. So if we're thinking about something like building the Channel Tunnel, to build the Channel Tunnel, a new company was created. And that company had its own finance department with lots of accountants in it. So depending on the size of the project, you may need something between 0 and lots of accountants to manage the finances. But on most projects, it's done by the project manager. Yeah. So good question. Thank you for that. Any other questions?
Yeah, Tony.
Do we need to calculate the pay for the account in the budget? Like, do we need to calculate the paying them, like paying the accountants? Is it going to be part of the budget? Yes. I don't know if you understand my question.
I do understand your question. And this goes back to something I was saying earlier, which is if the project is being provided with a member of staff to do some work, it's really important that the project manager understands whether they have to pay for that person or not. Because if they're coming to you for free, that's great. But if you have to pay for them, you want to know that right at the start of their engagement, because you have to plan for that cost. You have to know that they're going to cost you £200 a day, £400 a day, £600 a day.
So you can include them in the budget,
so
as
that
well.
you include them in the budget along with all the other people that are working on the project. Yeah. And okay, I think you had a question.
Yeah, I was just one thing. Where do we also consider this sunk funds in PM as well?
Sorry, the
you know, I don't know if you know about sunk costs.
Sunk costs.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So let me just check I understand what a sunk cost is. So I think my understanding of a sunk cost is it's money that's been spent already. It's money that perhaps appears as the actuals of a project. So we have spent the money's gone. Whatever benefit we were going to get from it, we've had that benefit. There's no getting that money back. That for me is what would be a sunk cost. Does that align with your understanding?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
So, but so that means we also have to consider it as well as part of the source of cost.
Yes, we have to consider it as an aspect of the actual cost of the project, that money has been spent. So we are recording the sunk costs. They are our actual costs that we've incurred, the money we've spent. But there is a particular concept around costs that particularly comes into play with Prince2 and product-based planning. And that concept is something called earned value. And the concept of earned value is that if I spend £50,000 buying something, if I get something that's worth £60,000 for that money, then I've earned some value. I've got £10,000 of value from spending the 50,000. Whereas if I spend 50,000 and only get something that's worth 40,000, then my earned value is negative. Yeah.
Right.
And particularly with Prince2, when you're using product-based planning, you can actually say each product we build, each thing we build has a cost, and we can say what the cost is. So product A is going to cost us £10,000 to build. Product B is going to cost £40,000 to build. Product C is going to cost £1 million. Now, if you build product A and you spend £8,000 on building it, then it's worth £10,000 when it's built. Then you've got £2,000 of earned value there. Now, if the project is stopped for some reason, you might not spend any of the other money that's been forecast. You might not get any of the other value that you were hoping to get from spending those other amounts of money, but you have got some earned value there of £2,000 because you spent £8,000 building product A that was worth £10,000. So sometimes on certain projects, project managers are expected to know what the cost of each product is that they're building, but also what the value is. And they're expected to report the value of what's been delivered as another line on the statement to the steering group. So this is something that is relatively unusual in the project world. This is why we didn't have it in the slide, but it does relate to sunk cost, because if you spent £8,000 building product A and it's worth 10,000, your sunk cost is £8,000. But if you spend, let's say we talk about product B for a while, and we say product B has a value of £60,000 and it was going to cost £50,000 to build. We may find if we start to build product B that it actually turns out to be much harder to build it than we realized. And we realize we can't build it for less than £100,000, but it's only going to be worth £60,000 when it's finished still. So the steering group may say, stop work on it. But at the point when the steering group says, stop work, if we've spent £30,000, that is a sunk cost. We spent £30,000, we've got £30,000 of actual costs that have been spent, but we haven't got any earned value because we never finished building product B. So sometimes when we are spending money, if we don't get any value for it, that's often when the term sunk cost is used, when we've spent money, but we've not got anything for it. It's almost like the money's been wasted.
Yeah.
It's sunk without a trace, sort of. There's no trace of benefit in the organization. It's sunk below the waves, and there's nothing visible of benefit on the surface. So it's often in that case when you're talking about earned value and the value of what you're delivering that you may more often come across the concept of sunk costs, where money's been spent but no value has been gained from spending the money.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sunk cost is something we should try and avoid as a good project manager.
Well, yes. So you can't avoid incurring cost, but you should try to avoid wasting money. So you should try to avoid having a cost that hasn't produced a benefit. So sometimes you won't be using product-based planning, and so you can't say that the value of this product is X and the value of that product is Y, but you can at least try to avoid wasting money, because if you waste money, then yes, the money has been lost for no good reason. Yeah. And
thank you.
I think to wrap up, it's one of the things that steering groups and sponsors, they expect project managers to be in control of the finances. They expect them to know how much money they're allowed to spend and how much they have spent and how much remains to be spent in order to complete the project. And steering groups and sponsors would like the forecasts to be accurate, but they're never going to be completely accurate. We do as much planning as we can, but the plan is just a plan. It's not necessarily able to guarantee that the project will run on time, that problems won't happen, that changes won't happen. And we'll talk about changes in the next session.